We're good to go and recording.
All right. This is an interview conducted by Dr. Emily Johnson on Friday, April 23rd, 2021, for the Muncie LGBTQ plus history project. I use she, her pronouns, and we are recording this via Zoom link while I sit at my home and Emma sits in the Burkhart building at Ball State University. I want to sincerely thank you for your time, not just for this interview, but all of the time you've put into the project and for agreeing to contribute to the project. So as you know, we are going to go through the normal script for the interview, as well as to talk about your work on the project as an undergraduate fellow and your work on the project earlier in the class, the oral history class in the spring 2020. So to begin, could you please introduce yourself?
I would be happy to. My name is Emma Cieslik. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am currently an undergraduate student at Ball State University studying public history and general biology with minors in anthropology and Spanish. I'm really interested in moving into a career focused in public history and museum studies, specifically at the intersections of religion and sexuality.
Wonderful. Would you mind sharing your age?
I would be happy to. I am currently 21. I turned 21 during the COVID-19 pandemic, so in a
Oh,
definite historical moment.
absolutely. And speaking of your future career plans, would you mind telling us what you're planning to do next year?
I would love to. I will be going on to pursue a Master's of Arts in Museum Studies at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. It will provide me wonderful opportunities to engage with the historical setting in D.C., as well as to contribute to museum efforts and exhibitions focused on my interest in religion.
So excited for you. When and where were you born?
I was born on June 10th, 1999 in Louisville, Kentucky, to Kimberly Rich Cieslik and David Allen Cieslik, my parents. I have one sibling named Jillian Rose Cieslik.
And where did you grow up?
I originally grew up until about the age of 5 in Louisville, Kentucky. All of my family is from that area, except that I do have some family on my father's side that are from the north side of Chicago with Polish heritage.
Mhm.
So I grew up mostly in Louisville, Kentucky. All of my family still live there to this day. But at the age of 5, my father was relocated because of his work, along with my family, to Crystal Lake, Illinois, which is an itty bitty suburb outside of Chicago.
And that's where you live still?
It is. It is. I'm excited for the move to DC, but a little bit nervous.
Mm. It's definitely a different place, but I think you'll like it. Um, so you've told me a little bit about your family of origin. Is there anything that you would like to add about them or about their influence in your life?
Most definitely. I really appreciate you asking. I grew up in a family that had a very strong Catholic influence throughout my life, which I think is important to mention in my own interest in religion. My uncle on my father's side is actually an ordained priest in the Roman Catholic Church, and I grew up with him residing over my baptism and my first communion, as well as my confirmation. So I had a really strong religious presence in my life. Both of my parents' sides of the family were practicing Catholics, although in my mom's side, I had some influence from Baptist religious influences from the Appalachian area in Kentucky where her family hails from. So
Mhm.
I grew up in a space that was very much conditioned by religion and saw it as just a necessary part of life. I attended St. Thomas the Apostle Catholic Church, located in Crystal Lake, Illinois, for the majority of my life ever since we moved to Crystal Lake, Illinois. It's a predominantly Polish and Italian church in the suburbs of Chicago. Um, and that was where I received most of the sacraments throughout my childhood. My confirmation sponsor was my grandmother, Patricia Rich, on my mother's side of the family, and religion has played an influence in who I consider close to myself and also how I develop my identity as a person.
When you say that there were Baptist influences on your mother's side, is that sort of the influence of the evangelical church in Southern Catholicism, or is it that you have relatives who are members of the Baptist church?
The latter. I have relatives who are part of the Baptist church, specifically my mother's grandmother on her side of the family is Baptist, and she would attend Baptist churches. They were even uncomfortable when my when my grandmother married my grandfather, and in a Catholic church, my grandfather on my mother's side comes from a Baptist religious lineage. His mother was Baptist as well, and when he converted to Catholicism to marry my grandmother, Patricia Rich, it was a really big moment in the family because it was a little bit of a religious schism. All of them had come from a very evangelical Christian background, but
Mhm.
shifting into Catholicism is definitely a big change.
I know there's a strong anti-Catholic tradition among Baptists in the South. What year would that have been, or what decade?
I believe they were married, this is going to sound very, very strange. I wear my grandmother's wedding ring, so I can
Oh.
actually check for you right now. They were married, here we go, in 1957.
That
Sorry about
uh,
that. I know
no,
I have it
no,
with me. That's why I thought I would check.
that's beautiful. I love the material religion, material, history components. Um, so what brought you to Muncie?
I originally came to Muncie for undergraduate education. I was the first of my school. I attended high school at Crystal Lake South High School in Crystal Lake, and I
Mhm.
was the first person from that school except for one other person to attend Ball State University. I received a flyer in the mail and was really intrigued, and so I came to Muncie, Indiana, fell in love with the community and the space and just how welcoming it was. Having grown up in Louisville, Kentucky until the age of 5, where I learned to speak and engage with people, a lot of my mannerisms fall into the line of Southern hospitality. So, which was very different from the Chicago space where I lived growing up. So, coming to Muncie, it felt like a very comfortable space socially wise. So, I came to Muncie because I felt comfortable in that space and in the environment, but I also came because I was offered the Whitinger Scholarship, which was a full ride scholarship for Ball State University, which made it possible for me to attend here.
Wonderful. I'm realizing I skipped ahead a little bit. So,
No worries.
how did religion affect your ideas about sexuality growing up?
That's a really interesting question. We recently conducted an interview with Rachel Replogle,
Mhm.
and it was when I really started to critically think about the influence of religion on my ideas about sexuality. Growing up, both of my parents, when they first married, lived in what's called Cherokee Triangle in Louisville, Kentucky. It's I wouldn't consider it a gayborhood in like in that same like understanding of it, just like we talked about with Morgan Roddy and other
Mhm.
individuals who lived in prominent ones. But it was a very LGBTQ plus affirming space. And my parents, having grown up in the Catholic Church, felt comfortable with that. They had many friends who identified with that sexual and gender identity, and so it never felt out of bounds for me either to identify that way growing up at all. I even had some people in my family say, if you ever identify that way or ever have conflicts about your gender identity or your sexual orientation, that's okay. We would love you and accept you just the same way, which is totally different from other people I've met in the Catholic Church and makes me a little bit of having an oddball childhood. But at, but at the same time, just as my parents were very liberal and open about that understanding of sexual orientation, I grew up in a parish, specifically St. Thomas the Apostle, that had very, very conservative ideas about female sexuality.
Mhm.
My parents always remained liberal throughout my childhood. They still are to this day, which shocked me because I thought they had conformed to the expectations of the church that we grew up in just to fit in and not create a stir. My mother was my religious education teacher growing up. And so for me growing up, I thought that they fell in line with the beliefs of the church, but it turned out, as I learned later, that was very, very different. So I grew up and I attended what was called, when I was about, I would say in middle school, what was called the True Beauty Retreat. So it was a set of retreats that was run by the head of religious education at St. Thomas called Kate Plata. And she would lead this retreat, and it was all about finding your inner, like, Christian and Catholic womanhood. But at the same time, embedded in that were really problematic ideas about what we learned in Rachel Replogle's interview about the body and sexual desire being sinful. So at that retreat, we were encouraged to pray for our future spouse, and it was made clear that that spouse would always be a man. Um, we were taught as well that I don't wear my grandmother's wedding ring as a purity ring, but we were taught about that tradition and its influence, as well as the idea of candle metaphors of your sexuality and your virginity acts like a candle. If you use it once, it's not going to be the same when you bring it to your partner in marriage. Um, as well as that idea about maintaining your virginity before marriage. So that was a big influence on how I understood my sexual identity. And that came a great deal from my religious experiences growing up. My church, coming from Polish and Italian lineages, never felt out of bounds related to liberties with alcohol. That was a big part of the community, or liberties in terms of strong family bonds. So the family unit was a big part of my childhood and a big emphasis on it, especially in a Polish parish where having respect for your parents was one of the central things we learned. But for me, growing up, religion had a really powerful impact and understanding on how I identified as a woman, as well as how I understood my sexuality, and how it could be used outside of the bounds of marriage, and how I could identify and understand with that. So I definitely understood and identified with what Rachel Replogle had said, and I think that's why when I came to Ball State and heard about the oral history workshop that you taught in spring 2020 about the Muncie LGBTQ History Project, I was really intrigued to explore something that was kind of blossoming in my own life of what does it mean to be a sexual being, or a being that has sexual desire and is not a sexual object but is a sexual person. So I think this project and this fellowship has been a really important part of that personal development in my life.
And can you say more about the candle metaphor for someone who might not be familiar with it?
I would love to. So we discussed it a little bit in the Rachel Replogle interview as well, but for many young is and it occurs both mostly for women, sometimes for men, but mostly for young women in Christian traditions. They will often be given a metaphor that describes how their virginity is something that is disposable, or is like one time usable. I always think of on the popular television show Jane the Virgin. We
Mhm.
see her as a young girl, and her grandmother, who is also Catholic, talks about how when you have your virginity, it's like a flower. But when you give your virginity, and again, it's used as a context of giving it or giving it away in a way, to somebody else, it's like crumpling up the flower. You can never get it to the state that it was before. So, just like that with the candle, if you're lighting your candle before marriage, something that's sacred, just like a candle that we see all over Catholic churches all the time, and especially with the Easter candle that remains up throughout the whole year, it's not going to be the same that it was beforehand. So your candle is going to be changed, and it's not going to be new when you theoretically hand it to your partner in marriage. So it kind of goes along with that same way. Like sometimes with I've known friends that had purity rings, and they
Mhm.
would give their purity ring or remove it after they get married as a sign that their purity in a way has expired, or something with those metaphors. So there are really interesting ones that came up in the Rachel Replogle interview as well. So it's really interesting to consider that with purity culture, which I think has to some degree experienced severe and important pushback today in the 21st century, but has also faced the consequences of increased and intensified evangelicalism in the United States.
Yeah, and can you say more about purity rings as well?
I would be happy to. So sometimes I come from a community that also Chicago is a very ethnic area, so there's also increasingly Irish neighborhoods that I live close to. I have Irish ancestry on my mother's side, so especially in those communities, they might have specific rings that have heart icons on it that you can use to designate your single versus quote unquote taken status.
Mhm.
And so usually a girl would wear them, and you would wear them throughout your whole childhood, mainly in your adolescent years. And it would be like a physical reminder of your virginity and to uphold that idea of sexual purity. So it would mean that you could engage with people and speak to them and have close, passionate relationships, but you just wouldn't take it to that point where you are having sexual contact with another person, especially a man. And so by keeping that promise to yourself and promise to an unknown but yet living and understood future partner, the purity ring is kind of like a material culture enforcer of that purity culture.
That makes sense. And how did you understand virginity? What was that sort of line?
That's a really interesting question because growing up, one thing I had always understood it kind of at a distance because growing up, my best friend was a boy, Owen McGrath. So I had always understood my gender identity as something that could be anything. I didn't feel that I had to live within these quote unquote feminist understandings of what it or femininity of understandings of what it meant to be a woman. I definitely identify with the feminist with the feminist lens. But I understood that, and my parents were very encouraging that I could be a rough person, I could play, I could go outside, I could be interested in insects, I could be interested in natural history, and that didn't discredit or disvalue my identity as a woman. But I think for me, growing up, I understood virginity as something separate from that feminine identity. I understood it up until about, I would say, during my college years as something that was kind of like that flower. It couldn't be rejuvenated after it had been taken.
Mhm.
So growing up, my mom was the big practitioner of my sexual education. Her mother was a nurse, so I received a really thorough sex education course growing up, and my mother was always empowering me to understand, and this was interesting coming from a Catholic perspective, that female sexual pleasure was an important part of sexual experience in a young woman's and woman's life throughout her entire life and throughout her partnerships. So I always understood sexual intercourse is an important and instinctive part of marriage and part of partnerships. So I always thought of virginity as something that from the church perspective could expire if used once, but from the perspective of my own home education could be an important part of marriage and of my own life. So it's a complex piece of my own religious and sexual identity that I'm still grappling with to this day.
Well, I think one of the things we've seen in the project is that it is always complex and in
Yes.
different ways for everyone. So did you have an understanding of gay marriage growing up? And if so, how did religion affect that understanding?
That's a really interesting question. Growing up in the Catholic Church, I always knew that gay marriage was kind of a taboo topic. It was, and we talked about it a little bit in the Rachel Replogle interview with the 180 youth group, where LGBTQ marriage was just not talked about, and they thought that by not exposing people, it wouldn't encourage. And during my childhood, that was definitely the case. For me, I never really heard about it. I had only experienced it a little bit when I had close family friends, given my parents' liberal leanings and their own friendships, that had decided to get married that were same-sex couples. And I had always understood that as a positive thing. Growing up in the Catholic Church, my parents had always encouraged me that love is the most important thing in your life. And if love is connecting someone, two people together, regardless of their gender identities or their sexual orientations, it's a beautiful thing and has to be cherished. So growing up, that was one thing that always stuck with me that pushed me a little bit away from the mainstream doctrine of the Catholic Church. And so I think for me, I always had to break a little bit with the theology about that. My mom growing up, she was very liberal and open-minded, but coming from the perspective of my religious education teacher, she had to follow a catechism. So as that, she had to tell me, "No, it's not allowed in the church. We don't associate with that." She always told me, "Gay and lesbian people are wonderful people. We respect them as people." So I always got that perspective. But that was one spot where I kind of diverted from that. And I think over time, my parents have definitely come to that perspective of, well, that's totally okay. I wouldn't see like why in the past, except for that point where she had to say it because of her role as a religious education teacher. They were very, very supportive of gay marriage.
And do you have a specific memory of the Obergefell decision, of when gay marriage became legal in the United States?
I do. I do. I was trying to think back. I do remember because I was in high school at the time, and many of my friends still to this day identify as Catholic. I actually have a close personal friend who's becoming a priest right now. He's in the seminary. And so for them, it wasn't as big a part of my friend group because nobody in my friend group identified as LGBTQ plus at all, but it wasn't an understanding that that was an important part of our friend group. So I think if anyone was, they would have been free to share it and we would have been supportive, but it just never came on the table. So for me, I remember it being a historic moment and I treasured it for that reason, given my interest in history. But it wasn't until really I came to college that it had a big impact. My freshman year, I had a roommate who I'm still very, very good friends with, and I'll avoid outing her in the interview just in case she doesn't want other people to know. Um, but she is one of the most important friends of my life, and she identifies as a lesbian woman. And so when I came to Ball State University, I roomed with her and we didn't know each other very well. It was kind of one of those random-ish situations. And when we first moved in together, I had made it clear because I went to mass every Sunday that I was Catholic and I identified that way. And we were playing Cards Against Humanity and one night, and when she was talking about her previous relationships and her sexual orientation, she felt a little bit hesitant around me. And so somebody finally asked her, "Do you identify as straight?" And she kind of was a little bit hesitant, but said, "I identify as a lesbian woman. I've had previous relationships with women. And so that's who I am. But I was a little bit nervous to come out to you because I was afraid you being a Catholic person and coming from that tradition that is in some ways very, very homophobic." And I was like, "Oh, I completely understand. You have a right to exist with that religious trauma. It's real." And I think that's important to acknowledge. But I wanted to change that perception. So moving forward, I thought it was important to exist and remain in the Catholic community, but also at the same time to strive to educate myself to be an ally. And so moving forward, she has been for a long time in a close relationship with the girl across the hall, seems just like a sitcom, who herself identifies as a pansexual woman. And so I've remained very close with them both. And I also have a friend who lives with them who identifies as asexual. So to be around them and to see what a big part their sexual identity has in their lives and what importance gay marriage has to that picture, and for the possibility to the both of them get married legally in the future. Looking back, it was a really, really important moment.
Mm. And I remember you saying that that experience with your roommate really influenced your desire to pursue these particular research interests.
Oh,
Could you say
definitely.
more about that?
I would be happy to. I was really curious because I came to college and I didn't have the language or terminology. When I came to college, I was a little bit feeble on my feet. I knew a little bit, but I think in my church as well as in my high school, I'd been a little bit sheltered to the ways of the world, just as I understood the legalization of gay marriage as an important historic moment. I didn't understand it as part of a movement that was happening and a push for greater equality and rights for LGBTQ individuals. So when I came to college and I had this experience with my roommate, I understood that I have to get the terminology about pronouns. I attended two trainings. So Ball State hosts the Safe Zone training and the Trans Safe Zone training, which offer education and awareness training for students and professors on campus to learn more about how to be a better ally, how to use the right pronouns, how to approach conversations of somebody coming out or somebody needing support. And so that's provided a little bit of an education to provide some footing for me as I move forward. I'm excited to see and understand that there's much that I need to learn. And I've definitely encountered that in the project, especially related to the transgender community that I didn't really know at all about before I went to college. So I think from Ball State, I've tried really hard to develop more of that understanding. And that was definitely sparked by my relationship with my roommate.
And so you mentioned allyship. Do you identify then as an ally?
I do. I identify as a cisgendered heterosexual woman.
Mhm.
Um, Throughout my childhood, I never felt uncomfortable about identifying as a woman who loved women, or as a woman who loved a man, or vice versa, or not having sexual desire at all. But coming into college and thinking more critically about that sexual orientation and gender identity, that is where I am right now. I would say, and it was something that I really found insightful in an interview we did with Reverend Kate Johnston, that I understand and appreciate that my sexual identity, just because sexuality is on a spectrum, my sexual orientation may not remain completely static in my life. And it's important to acknowledge that in the future, if I become in a close relationship with a woman, I am completely okay with that moving forward and totally accept that, as well as that for anyone around me. But at this moment, that's how I currently identify.
And can you say, I think you have sort of gestured at this, but can you reflect a little bit on what allyship means to you?
Yes. It's a really interesting question because I originally went to the safe zone training, and when I walked in they asked us all why we were attending, and many of the professors said I'm here to be a good ally. I'm here to support my students any way I can. And I said I'm here for my roommate. And it felt a little weird at the time. There were people in the room that were like, "Oh, good for you," applauding me. But I walked away from that moment and it took several months to reflect. I should want to go there and learn this information because I want to be a better human being, not necessarily because my friendship with this roommate is very important to me, but it's important that I'm doing this because I value it for everyone, not just her. And so for me, being a positive and impactful ally is not only not exuding homophobia, not making homophobic responses, not standing by as something traumatic happens to someone, and also validating that the trauma that they've experienced is real and valid, but also at the same time speaking up. So there have been people in when I'm in the Catholic Church, when I'm at Mass, that come up to me or maybe make a homophobic comment, and I'm normally soft mannered by by just my personality. But those are the moments where I have to stand up and make my understanding of this issue known. And I think that moment in allyship, wearing a pin that says that I have safe zone training, that I'm a safe ally, putting my pronouns in my email signature and also on my LinkedIn social media site, as well as on Facebook. It's an important moment and initiative that I need to make, and it involves action, not inaction. And it's also led to many different conversations with people I never thought I would engage with. My dad was a little confused the past couple years when the pronouns popped up in my email signature. What are those, Emma? Why are you putting them there? And so it actually led to a great conversation about, why do we need to put pronouns in our signatures? Why is it important to ask people this? And also, when I was coming out of church one day, one of my close friends, Sierra Sandwith, who also attends St. Francis Catholic Church and is a student here at Ball State, was asking me, "Hey, Emma, I noticed that you have this safe zone button on your backpack, and I know that you go to church every week. How do you adjust those understandings of being a faithful Catholic individual, but pushing back at certain parts of Catholic doctrine and theology? How do you exist with that? Like, how do you be a little oxymoron?" Um, it was led to a great conversation about, I love my church and I love the faith that I get to be part of because it emphasizes love and social work and justice and equity. But at the same time, I acknowledge that it's a human institution and human institutions have flaws and need to acknowledge their shortcomings. And those areas specifically related to LGBTQ identity within the church, as well as gay marriage, are places where I split.
You mentioned the importance of sort of standing up against people making kind of homophobic or transphobic comments. Is there a particular moment that you can point to? Has there been an experience that sort of stands out to you in that regard?
I think one of the largest ones for me was that I remember for this project, actually, I had for the oral history workshop course in spring 2020, we were asked to seek out individuals in the community who identified as LGBTQ to conduct oral history interviews. And I initially was like, I want to research people who identify as LGBTQ in the Catholic Church. And it was a moment of transformation because I realized people don't always identify as out within the Catholic Church for fear of real and valid hatred and homophobia that exists. And so I had gone up to the priest, and this was before I understood this completely, who Father Dorr, who has recently been transferred out of this specific part of the diocese. And I asked him, "Do you know of any LGBTQ individuals?" And at first, I had always known Father Dorr kind of at a distance. I cantored at St. Francis Catholic Church where I attended, so he knew my face, he knew my name. And he said, "What do you mean by that?" He just didn't understand the term LGBTQ. And I tried to put it more in layman's term. I mean, like, gay or lesbian individuals that you know of in the church. And he says, "I don't know of anyone. Like, do they even go here? And then there was a young man that he was talking to. Um, and he was a close friend of Father Dorr. He was a student at Ball State. And he goes, well, I mean, like, are you gay? And he like meant it as a joke for the guy who was standing next to him. And I kid you not, it was the most awkward, cringy moment because this young man was embarrassed to even be joked about as a gay man. And it was one of those moments where, for a long time, I felt comfortable identifying in the Catholic Church, saying, well, I mean, I don't identify with all of that. I can still remain in here. But when I saw religious leaders as being um, purveyors of homophobia, especially people that are ordained within the church, um, my uncle is a priest, and he is very much liberal leaning along with my parents. So I always grew up with the understanding that religious leaders within the Catholic Church could accept and identify with that schism in their own understandings and appreciation of LGBTQ individuals. My uncle met up actually with my father and his lesbian coworker in Las Vegas. Long story. And he always joked that they seemed like a joke. What happens when a priest, a lesbian, and a construction worker walk into a bar in Las Vegas? But it was nice because my father's coworker, who identified as a lesbian, got the reverse situation. It was the moment where she had met a Catholic priest who actively and openly accepted and affirmed her identity and loved her just as she was. So it was the moment what I had always grown up with, she was experiencing for the first time. And so I think I always grew up with the positive role models of priests within the Catholic Church, but that moment at St. Francis was definitely an eye-opening experience. Cringy, but a necessary eye-opening experience.
Mhm. So, we talked about your moving to Muncie for your education at Ball State. What year did you first move here?
I first moved here in August of 2017. I've lived in the dormitory Dehority complex over the past 4 years, and I will be graduating in about 2 weeks, which is crazy to think about.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Um, how does Muncie compare to other places that you have lived?
Strangely enough, a lot of people I meet that come to Muncie think that it's a very insular area, that it very much has that white, heterosexual, Midwestern identity to it. But strangely enough, a lot that I've experienced here in Muncie has challenged my own experiences in Chicago suburbs. Where I grew up, white, heterosexual Illinois was all I understood and all I knew. So I knew one of my close friends who was a Hindu. I also knew one of my close friends who was a Muslim woman, but those were the only really experiences I had. I came from predominantly Eastern European identifying communities and people who I knew who were gay or had different gender and sexual identities, but who I wasn't really close to growing up. We were good friends, but they existed somewhat out of the social circles because of the trauma and the hatred that they experienced. So when I came to Muncie, I was really curious to see kind of this small to middle-sized Midwestern city as an exploratory point. So during my sophomore year, I reached out to a professor, Dr. Robert Phillips, who currently is an assistant professor of anthropology here, because I was interested in conducting archival research about this community. I had experienced a little bit on campus and knew about Spectrum, which is the LGBTQ affiliated organization on campus, but I also knew about Hillel, which is a Jewish student organization on campus. And I also knew about the Muslim Student Association on campus. And I was really curious to kind of dive into understanding and learning new things. So I reached out to Dr. Phillips and he offered for me to become an archival research assistant in his research retinue, and I started conducting research related to the Jewish community here in Muncie, specifically Martin Schwartz, who was a local Jewish paper salesman. And so I started conducting that research. And as I was doing that, I was able to engage more closely with the Jewish community here in Muncie. I currently attend services at the Temple Bethel Synagogue, both as part of participant observation of the community ongoing, but also as part of friendships that I've made with people, friendships in Hillel and the student organizations, as well as with members of the synagogue. So that experience, as well as what I encountered later in the archives, specifically elements of anti Semitism that existed in the Jewish community, especially what was called the X Ray, which was a really inflammatory anti Jewish newspaper that was published by Court Asher. He was actually censured because of this newspaper and how inflammatory some of these comments were, especially about Martin Schwartz. So realizing that bigotry existed in a community and in its history that I had adopted as my own here in Muncie, but also finding people who had different religions and different perspectives from myself really was an eye-opening experience.
And have you experienced any intersections between the Jewish community in Muncie and the LGBTQ community in Muncie?
Not formally. I've met many people within the community. I currently serve as the vice president for a short period of time of Hillel, the student organization. But I haven't met anyone who identified. Well, I take that back. I actually do know one individual who's part of the Hillel organization who identifies as a transgender man. So, and as part of that organization, as much as I've known, the president as well as the officers and everyone involved are very, very supportive of him. There was always focus on making sure to use the right pronouns. People were always corrected immediately whenever an error was made, and they felt very much involved within the community. So it was nice to see how openly that was accepted, and definitely challenged my perception that all religions were in some ways homophobic. I think because I came from such a Catholic background, that learning about the openness and acceptance of Reform Judaism was really refreshing.
Is it your perception that the acceptance of that transgender individual is theologically based in any way?
I believe so. From my perspective and what I've learned about Judaism through that project and through an honors undergraduate fellowship in fall 2019, where I interviewed people in the community about their experiences today, I learned that specifically in Orthodox and Hasidic and conservative sects of Judaism, there is persisting homophobia, especially against LGBTQ individuals in that community. But Reform Judaism has interpreted the scriptures that come from the Jewish tradition to accept and welcome LGBTQ individuals. And they've been very, very focused on social justice issues, LGBTQ inclusion, and very, very supportive of gay marriage and gender transitions.
Wonderful. And so I want to transition now to talking about your work with the Muncie LGBTQ History Project. How did you first hear about the project?
I first heard about the project, I believe, through an email chain. I remember I was looking at specific departmental courses available in history, and I was curious what an oral history workshop was. So I'm sitting in the oral history studio right now, which is located on the second floor of Burkhart Building. And in this studio, I actually conducted my first 3 oral history interviews as part of the Ball State Honors College Oral History Project. So I worked with Dr. Michael Doyle, who is since retired, and we focused on conducting interviews with faculty members who worked in the Honors College, staff members, and retired professors who still were connected to the Honors College. So because of that experience, I was really curious to learn about what more oral history skills I could learn. I had done some transcriptions and some oral history interview question write-ups, but I was curious because I loved that experience so much to keep going. So I heard about the oral history workshop and immediately enrolled. And it wasn't until the first day when I sat down that I realized it was the Muncie LGBTQ History Project. So it kind of came from my own love of oral history and oral historical research that I happened into the project.
Wonderful. And so what so you had this experience in Dr. Doyle's class earlier. How would you say that your experiences compare in the two oral history projects?
Yes, the first one, the Ball State Honors College Oral History Project, was very much regimented. We had a semester-long immersive learning project that was very much focused on these many people have to be interviewed by the endpoint. You will do 3 interviews, you will transcribe them. You have already been assigned your person. So very much regimented in what the process would look like. And it was wonderful because starting out, I was still a little bit wobbly on my feet with interviewing anyone at all and also conducting historical research. But what I loved about the Muncie LGBTQ History Project and the Oral History Workshop is I could really delve into my own historical interests. So in that class, I was a little apprehensive about taking on the issue and the complex thing that is religion related to sexuality, but being able to choose and interview individuals. I interviewed Peter Douglas, who currently serves as an organist at First Presbyterian Church, and Kate Johnston, who currently serves as a chaplain in labor and delivery at Ball Memorial Hospital. To be able to interview them and focus on my own interests and use that as a way to develop personally and professionally was wonderful.
And how did you find your interviewees?
Yes. So after that rather unsettling experience with Father Door, I was feeling a little shaken. And so I was walking over, and so I live in DeHority. And so it goes DeHority, and then between St. Francis and DeHority is located First Presbyterian Church. It's a very large and very old church located in Muncie. And so I had never been inside it before. I had lived on campus for 2 years at that point and had still never been inside before. And so as I was walking home, I was a little shaken and decided I would pop my head in to see what was going on. So when I did that, it was just at the end of services because I had walked to talk to Father Dorr after Sunday Mass. And when I got to First Presbyterian, I asked if I could speak to I asked, can I speak to the priest? And they're like, well, it's called a pastor. Are you new? Which they were very, very welcoming and open. So I was waiting around, waiting to speak to the pastor who was relatively new, and I bump into Reverend Kate Johnston. I didn't know who she was at all, but she was very kind and open and asked, "Do you need something? Are you waiting for someone?" And so I asked who she was. I was really intrigued by her work, especially related to labor and delivery and chaplaincy at Ball Memorial. And so I first met her through that way. And then she introduced me to the pastor who introduced me to Peter Douglas, who at the time of the interview was a graduate student at Ball State University and was working as an organist at First Presbyterian.
Cool. Um, and tell me a little bit, you mentioned sort of the historical moment of COVID. How did COVID affect your work with the Oral History Project?
Most definitely. It had a really interesting effect. And I think that follows along well with the story of the project. I reached out to Peter Douglas and Reverend Kate Johnston very early in the process. And I was really eager to get them involved. And so it ended up that I conducted the first two interviews for the oral history workshop. And it was conducted in the room that I'm currently sitting. And so we conducted the two interviews. I remember distinctly that at the end of Peter Douglas's interview, Will, who was working as the graduate student on the project, went to shake Peter's hand and immediately was asked not to because of COVID. And we knew COVID a little bit when we were conducting the interviews, but it seems like an off in the distance threat. So we were able to conduct both of the interviews actually in person in the spring semester in 2020. And just a couple weeks later, Ball State University was closed down on campus because of the pandemic. And I was sent home. So I was still able to have in-person interviews to transcribe them. But it meant that taking on the next step of the Honors Undergraduate Fellowship project would mean that it would have to be completely virtual. So we were originally planning to start in fall 2020, but because of issues with the pandemic and issues with scheduling, it shifted to spring 2021. And through that process, I was really eager to figure out what a Zoom interview would look like. So I conducted several on the phone over the summer with another honors undergraduate fellowship with Dr. Robert Phillips. So for this project, this fellowship, this semester, I played with the use of Zoom. And we actually learned, you and I learned well that Zoom is wonderful for transcription services, especially pulling that transcript straight from the Zoom recording site. But I also learned, and it was really, really interesting, that people, when they're doing Zoom interviews, when they don't do it often, choose some of the most interesting clothes and interesting backgrounds to wear. especially Pastor Robert Abner, that was seated in his own professional office where he does a lot of his liturgical work. It was really, really fascinating to see how people wanted to be portrayed for longevity and wanted to have their historical image remembered. So it was really, really fascinating. I think Professor or Pastor Abner's interview was the most interesting in terms of backgrounds, but everyone had really, really interesting clothing that they chose to wear and emphasize. So it was wonderful to see where they live and where they make their home.
Mm. And as we have discussed, there's sort of a question among oral history practitioners about whether video adds or takes away from that experience. And I think we have sort of felt that not only does video add to the experience, but that experience of seeing people's own spaces has been wonderful. I will just add as well, the reason that we were both laughing when you talked about the handshake is that I believe what happened is that I jumped between them and yelled, "No."
Yes.
So I just feel like somebody watching in the future is going to be like, why do they think that's so funny? And that is a gentle viewer. Uh,
I loved how vigilant you were. And we could not have predicted how much would have changed in the next several weeks in terms of the pandemic.
no, and Sue Arrington was the last person we interviewed, and I was really, really grateful that we got that interview in and that we got your interviews in before everything just sort of had to shut down. Yeah, and here we are. Now we're very good.
Yes.
So what would you say that you have learned over the course of the research? What stands out to you?
One of the most important things that I've learned throughout the process is all about the multiple facets of being an ally. So, throughout the process, we've had wonderful moments. We've talked about experiences of Reverend Kate Johnston working on the labor and delivery floor, specifically bringing joy and spirituality to moments of adoption and surrogacy for same sex couples at Ball Memorial. But we've also had really heartbreaking moments, especially in interviews, including that of Buddy Jones, that talked about elements of family trauma that go in with gender transitions and changes in people's lives. So I think for me, it's really provided me insight into how to exist and celebrate, but also understand and suffer with people in the moments that make a life beautiful, but also make an identity of LGBTQ unique. So I think for me, being able to live and sit and hear and listen to somebody talk about an instance of family trauma, an instance where they were rejected by their family, or where they were just as likely loved by their family or welcomed by their family is important. And I think that this project has taught me a great deal about how to negotiate those different experiences that people have, but also the importance in documenting all of them.
Mhm. And um, I don't want this to turn into an oral exam. That's not what this is. But you mentioned that the issue of religion is so complex, and particularly those intricacies of um, religion and sexuality are so complex. Do you feel like there are any sort of insights that you have gained that you would be able to articulate conclusions, or do you feel like you're still sort of living in that complexity?
I think I'm a little bit of both. I still very much am living in the complexity, but at the same time, one thing that was a really big takeaway from the project was the existence of safe religious spaces in Muncie, which is one thing that we've been developing some research related to this moving forward. And I think one thing that was really impactful for me was learning about Laura Janney, who started Muncie Outreach through the United Unitarian Universalist Church here in Muncie. And she was started it actually with a religious leader who had a gay child, just as she did herself. And they started it, and it actually currently lives at the Young Women's Christian Association downtown. the YWCA. And both of those spaces, while they're traditionally religious and identify as religious, have become very safe, open, and affirming spaces, just like Lutheran Church of the Cross and Grace Village, which are run by Pastor Robert Abner. And I also think about how religion exists in different ways and requires different things in different spaces. So just as Grace Village and Lutheran Church of the Cross and the UU Church are open and affirming, there's also a need for spiritual health care and spiritual knowledge in healthcare settings. And it was really eye-opening to think about that. And speaking with Reverend William Grinstead and Reverend Kate Johnston opened a whole new avenue to think really critically about what other spaces religion exists in and has a role, and what other spaces require informed, open, and affirming religious practitioners. So I think moving forward, thinking about specific services of loss and grieving. Reverend William Grinstead is a palliative care chaplain, so he deals with people sometimes at the hardest moments of their lives, but also thinking about other spaces for religion, specifically spaces of baptism, or people that work in religious avenues in government or in social services. So it definitely opened a whole new understanding of what religion is, but also opened the idea that I could exist as a religious person and also appreciate that religious spaces exist as safe and open and affirming. And that gave me a lot of hope moving forward as somebody who doesn't want to completely reject religion in my life, but wants to create and like craft new safe spaces for others.
Mhm. And is there something that stands out to you as the most surprising, something that you didn't expect when you started?
One of the most exciting things that I learned through the project was actually my interview with Reverend Kate Johnston. Even though it was one of the first ones we conducted, it was one of the most impactful. I had reached out to her, and I know you and I had sort of an informal conversation before the oral history interview, where we we wanted to make sure to keep all of the exciting information for being recorded. And so she had mentioned a little bit how so she attended McCormick Theological Seminary in Illinois, and she had conducted a thesis research project focused on intersex babies. And so it was really, really interesting. I come from a background, I'm a general biology major. So I'm familiar a little bit from friends that are going into medicine tracks as well as to dental tracks about healthcare settings and the needs of somebody approaching it from a medical perspective. But it wasn't until I was actually sitting there and speaking with her and thinking about the conditions of intersex babies coming into this world that it really surprised me. And I think it was the moment in the project when I realized how complex and nuanced all of this research and all of these histories would be. Reverend Kate Johnston spoke specifically about when babies come into the world, they're an exciting and nerve wracking and wonderful little bundle.
Oh no.
I think it is the testing site.
Okay.
Yes, I apologize.
It's
um,
okay.
so I remember, maybe I should wait a minute.
I can hear you.
Okay, sounds good. So I remember she would say that these are babies that people dream of, they worry about, they cry, they laugh over, they love, and they come into this world that's distinctly gendered. So when a baby comes into this world, it gets a little knit hat from a wonderful volunteer that's either blue or pink. The
Mhm.
hospital has balloons that are blue or pink, or it's a boy, it's a girl. But we never exist and understand that some babies are born intersex. So there's no resources for babies that like have little purple hats or little purple balloons. And because of that, a lot of parents sometimes feel forced into surgical or healthcare decisions that choose one gender right after a baby is born that could impact that person for the rest of their lives. And in some ways, the gendered way in which hospitals and labor delivery departments are set up encourage that and encourage hasty decisions to reinforce a binary of gender. So I think it really, really opened my eyes when Reverend Kate Johnston spoke about the importance of this research and the importance of religious practitioners, including chaplains, in these moments to walk in and say, unless your baby is having a health complication, unless they are dying or have a severe illness, this is a moment to cherish and pause and enjoy and remember. You don't have to make this hasty medical decision about potential surgeries that would compromise or affect the gender identity of your child in the future. Just enjoy and live in the moment. And I'm here to support your spiritual and emotional and moral needs in that time. So it really opened my eyes to just how multifaceted gender and LGBTQ plus identity is, but also the importance of religious people working in all of these spaces.
Mhm.
I never would have thought of a chaplain coming in during an episode of delivery, or coming into a delivery room, or being with a woman during labor. And I think it opened my eyes to the importance of religious practitioners out of Father Door and a priest and a typical practitioner I see every day, who in the Catholic Church does all of these different sacraments and services. And so it was really, really impactful and surprised me a great deal.
Wonderful. Um, One of the things that came up in your earlier answer was thinking about sort of how your experience as an interviewer has shaped your thinking about your own identity and about your own place and about the kinds of communities that you want to foster. And one of the things that we've talked about is the kind of connection between oral history as a practice, but also advocacy, and how those two things are are related, particularly when we're talking about doing oral history interviews in minority communities. And so I wondered, at this point in your professional development, what do you see as the relationship between professional research like this project and advocacy for the kind of community and world that you want to see?
Most definitely. That's a wonderful question. And that ties into the idea that I think it's a very fine and blurred line. I started the project and thought, this is a research project. It's just as previous projects focused on Jewish and Catholic communities here in Muncie that I've conducted. But at the same time, the more that I got into interviews, specifically those for Betty Jones and Morgan Roddy, I learned that I was a benefactor for a very important and sensitive kind of history and story. So, specifically in moments like Buddy Jones's interview, where we were discussing how she identified and how her own experiences were shaped by her family relationships, I understood that this may be the only record that Buddy leaves behind. And it's going to be a record that shows her chosen name on it. It's going to be a record that shows her as a transgender woman with the gender identity that she chose. And so I understood that that is a really important and critical part of my role as an oral historian, and something unique to conducting oral histories about gender and sexual identity. So, one of my favorite things is here in the oral history office that we have here in our recording studio. There's one specific quote that talks about the importance of leaving an address in your life. And Dr. Michael Doyle, who I worked with for the Ball State Honors College Oral History Project, talked very specifically about making sure that we leave an address when we pass on from this world. And this oral history can be that address, can be what we leave moving forward, to make sure that our legacy, that our histories, that our experiences are remembered and kept and cherished. And so I think for me, making sure that people's sexual and gender identities, that their chosen identities are made and captured and celebrated with these stories and are cared for respectfully and authentically, is a big part of how I see myself as an ally and how I see myself as an advocate.
Hmm. And have you been involved at all in any kind of LGBTQ community in Muncie?
Yes, I with my friends that I mentioned, my roommate and her partner, as well as there are 5 of them living in a house together off campus. With them, they very much influenced and impacted my understanding of my own sexual identity. They call the house that they live in the Estra Den. So for
Hmm.
them, they very much think and talk about their own sexual desires, their own sexual identity. So it gave me a space to feel safe to explore that in myself. So for them, I very much identify in their community that they openly claim as LGBTQ. I also, in the same vein, identify with LGBTQ communities off campus as well. The pandemic halted me being able to visit the Mark III tap room in Muncie because I turned 21 during quarantine and haven't been able to go visit it during the COVID-19 pandemic. But I definitely identify with and frequent gay-owned and gay-run businesses in the Muncie area. Specifically, I have visited the Queer Chocolatier, which is a small chocolate truffle company that existed right off campus and now is moving to downtown. It's run by Morgan Roddy and her wife Sherry.
Mhm. So you are graduating and going off to wonderful things. But if you were in charge of the Muncie LGBTQ project, what direction would you want to take it in the future?
I would want to continue conducting oral history interviews. I know for me, one of the joys of being involved in this project was being able to research religion. But the best parts of the interviews were when we set out to explore and record oral histories and discovered religion along the way. I remember the last oral history that we conducted with Rachel Replogle. We started and so Rachel Replogle is the only LGBTQ affirming wedding videographer in Indiana, which is, as she says, wonderful and horrifying at the same time. Um, but for her, we started out the interview eager to talk about her job experience and actually spoke a great deal for a long period of time about her own religious identity because I had that background and thought to look into and explore how that had affected her sexual identity.
Mhm.
So I think for me, allowing students and people working on the project to continue exploring their own avenues, because I think, and just as this interview goes to show, every oral historian and oral history researcher brings their own perspective to the project that they conduct. So with this one, I was very much interested and eager to engage with ideas of religion. And that impacted the questions that I asked people, including Morgan and Anthony Amstutz, which I interviewed, and Laura Janney, and affected who I sought out to interview throughout the project. But at the same time, somebody interested in healthcare settings or in specific elements of homelessness or social justice or food insecurity within the LGBTQ community. So I think for me, continuing to gather oral history interviews, but also at the same time empowering students, just like you did for me, to take on this project moving forward and make it my own has really been wonderful. And I would love to see continue.
And I would like to say for the record that I have been so impressed by your work and so grateful for all of the work that you've done as a research fellow. You have made immeasurable contributions to this project that will really, really help us moving forward. So, is there anything we haven't discussed that you would like to talk about?
Um, I think the only thing that I wanted to also say on the record is to thank you sincerely, Dr. Johnson, for all of your mentorship and your support throughout this project. Like you had touched on in the questions that you asked, this has been a really, really important project for my own personal development. I started with an understanding that I was an ally, and that understanding was challenged. Moving forward about what it meant to be an ally and standing up for the people that I love and treasure and the people that I don't know who identify within the LGBTQ community. So I think it's been a really important project for my development, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of it.
Well, thank you for saying so. It's really been wonderful to work with you. I have joked repeatedly that I was going to try and undermine your graduation so that I could be here forever. And I am not going to do that, but I am going to miss you. So, with that, I think I will conclude the interview. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. I know when you signed up, you didn't sign up to be an interviewee, but I really appreciate your willingness to record your experiences. Um, let's stop.
Sounds great.